June 25, 2025. In a small, cold, brightly lit room in Mississippi, a man lay motionless on a stretcher. He was 79 years old. His hair was gray. His breathing was slow and heavy. His thin arms were immobilized, as if time itself had bound him for nearly half a century. No more noise, no more crowds, no more lawyers arguing, only the faint sound of a heartbeat echoing within the emotionless walls, a syringe prepared, a familiar procedure, a death that had been scheduled long ago. That man's name is Richard Gerald Jordan. He had waited for this day for 49 years. 49 years waking up each morning with the same question, is today my last day? 49 years living in a room where time stood still, where only old hopes faded and fears repeated themselves. Outside the execution chamber, America continues to move forward. Generations change, laws change, the world changes. But for Richard Jordan, everything stopped in 1976. Once the drug began to take effect, no one could be certain of one thing, whether justice had finally been served or whether it had come too late. And that's when the biggest question arises, not just for America, but for all of us. Is a sentence that lasts almost a lifetime truly justice? America in 1976, a time without ubiquitous surveillance cameras, no cell phones, no DNA or modern databases. Back then, people still trusted each other immensely, especially in small towns where everyone believed they knew each other. Edwina Marta lives in a community like that. She's 35, a mother, an ordinary woman, with very ordinary worries, work bills, dinner for the kids. Edwina's life is unremarkable, and perhaps that's what makes her so relatable to anyone listening to a story. Edwina's house wasn't big, but it held her whole world. The laughter of her children, simple meals, quiet evenings when the whole family gathered together. For Edwina, it was a place of safety, a place no one had the right to trespass. That evening began just like any other day. Edwina was home alone. The children weren't there. There were no signs that danger was imminent. Then the phone rang, a familiar sound, not urgent, not suspicious. The person on the other end of the line introduced himself as an electrician. His voice was calm and polite. He said there was a problem with the power lines in the area, and that the electricity meter needed to be checked immediately that night to avoid danger. Edwina hesitated for a few seconds, but in 1976, calls like that weren't uncommon. People believed in uniforms. They believed in titles. They believed that the repairmen were simply doing their job. She agreed to open the door. Edwina could not have known that this small decision, lasting only a few seconds, would be the last moment of her life. There was no premonition, no warning signs, just an ordinary woman, believing she was doing the right thing. And it was that very trust that led her to face a tragedy no one could have foreseen. As dawn broke after the night of the crime, the small town where Edwina Marta lived felt strangely different. The familiar streets were still there, the houses silent, but the sense of security had vanished. A woman had been murdered in her own home, and that left every door vulnerable. The police began their investigation under very limited conditions. In 1976, they had no DNA, no security cameras, no telephones for tracing. Everything depended on testimony, speculation, and incomplete pieces of evidence. They knew this wasn't an accident. It wasn't a spontaneous act. This was a premeditated murder. The killer had prepared, he had lied, he had a gun, and he had left almost no trace. In that context, the name Richard Gerald Jordan began to appear in investigative files. Jordan was a vagrant, no stable job, a minor criminal record, no one to defend his reputation. To the police, he was a convenient suspect, an easy target in a community gripped by fear and uncertainty. Jordan was interrogated for hours, In a closed room, no lawyer was present at crucial moments. Then, a confession was given. But that very confession became the center of controversy for decades afterward. Jordan said he was coerced. He was pressured. He was manipulated into giving false testimony. He maintained he did not kill Edwina Mata. But the justice system at the time had little patience for suspects like him. The trial proceeded quickly. The jury was not presented with information about the controversial interrogation techniques. There was no scientific evidence to refute them. All they had was the prosecution's story, piecing together missing details, and a defendant who lacked the persuasive ability to defend himself. The verdict has been announced. Death penalty. When the judge's gavel struck, Richard Gerald Jordan became a death row inmate, not after a flawless investigation, not after an impeccable trial, but in a system riddled with loopholes where speed is sometimes more important than certainty. For Edwina Mata's family, that sentence was their only consolation. They believed that justice had been served, that the person who took a mother's life would pay the price. But for Richard Jordan, that was the moment his life froze. From that moment on, every day ahead had only one end: death. And no one could have imagined that the path from that verdict to the final moment would last nearly half a century. The moment the door opened, everything changed. The man standing in front of Edwina carried no electrical tools, no uniform, no name tag, only a cold gaze and a gun drawn swiftly, as if he had rehearsed this moment many times in his head. Edwina didn't have time to understand what was happening. In an instant, the house, once the safest place, became a trap. The trust that had just been there immediately turned into fear. Not a violent fear, but a suffocating feeling, as one realizes they have completely lost control. He demanded money. His voice was deep and firm. No shouting, no trembling, just a cold command. Edwina obeyed, not for the money, but for hope. Hope that if she complied, it would all end there. But for someone who has entered someone else's home with a gun, money is never the end goal. Edwina was being held captive, forced to move around in her own home. Every step felt heavy. Every second dragged on endlessly. She thought of her children, of the unfinished dinner, of the small, ordinary things she didn't realize she would never experience again. There was no major struggle, no cries for help echoed, just a brief moment when gunfire rang out in the confined, dry, and merciless space. Edwina Mata collapsed. Everything became eerily silent. The perpetrator left quickly, leaving behind a house devoid of warmth. No one heard, no one saw. No one knew that a mother had just been taken from her life, right in the place that should have protected her. When the police arrived at the scene, there were no signs of a violent struggle, only motionless bodies. Objects were scattered, and a chilling atmosphere permeated the room. Edwina's 2 children would never hear their mother recount the story of that day. They only knew that, from that moment on, there was a void that could never be filled. A crime occurred, silently, quickly, and its consequences lasted for decades. The death chamber is not what one might imagine. It's not always filled with screams or despair. Most of the time there is only silence, a silence so profound that one begins to hear their own thoughts. Richard Gerald Jordan entered the death row when he was just 35 years old. He was still young enough to believe that a verdict could be overturned, that there would be a better lawyer, new evidence, some kind of miracle would happen just in time. But as the days went by, the miracle didn't happen. Life in prison is broken down into monotonous routines. Waking up, eating, taking a few steps in the cramped space, waiting for the lights to go out, then waiting for another day to begin. Time here isn't measured in years, but in failed appeals. Each time his appeal for a stay of execution was denied, Jordan moved closer to his inevitable death. Sometimes he wrote letters to the court, sometimes he wrote to people he had never met, and sometimes, on some nights, he would just lie still, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer he had to live. Outside the prison bars, the world is constantly changing. America is entering new decades. Technology is advancing. Laws are being amended. Many old cases are being overturned thanks to DNA. But in the death row, all change comes very slowly, if not never. Richard Jordan grew old in that room. His hair turned gray. His back became hunched. The pains became more frequent. The people imprisoned with him disappeared one by one. Some had their sentences reduced. Some were exonerated. Some were taken away to be executed and never returned. Each time the iron door opened, his heart tightened. No one in the death wards knew the day they would die. They only knew that one day their name would be called. Elsewhere, Edwina Marta's family also lived through the same time, but in a very different way. They grew old with the memory of a mother, a loved one who had been taken away forever. For them, each passing year did not erase the pain, but only allowed it to subside, smoldering and lingering to people, to destinies, inextricably linked by a crime, even though they never intended it. For 49 years, Richard Jordan existed in a state of limbo between life and death. Not entirely free, but not yet dead either. A life prolonged merely to await its end. And then, when most people believed he would die in prison of old age, the final announcement came. No more appeals, no more delays. The waiting time is over. The morning of June 25, 2025 arrived very slowly. In his cell, Richard Gerald Jordan woke up earlier than usual. No clock, no need for a clock. He already knew what day it was. His aging body reacted more noticeably than ever. His breathing was heavy. His heart beat slowly. Every movement took longer. The jailer opened the door. His voice was calm, polite, no longer hostile. Just a procedure repeated many times with those before him. Jordan was informed of his last meal. He ate very little. Not out of fear, but because his body no longer wanted to retain anything. As he was led through the familiar corridors, Jordan walked slowly. Each step seemed to touch upon the 49 years that had passed, the faces he had seen, the doors that had closed, the moments of hope and disappointment. All came flooding back in silence. The execution chamber was stark white, cold. There was no room for emotion. Jordan lay on the stretcher. His arms were immobilized. The straps tightened gently. It didn't hurt, but it was enough to remind him that, from now on, he had no choice. They asked if he had any last words. Richard Gerald Jordan is dead. His name has been removed from the death row list. The case file is closed. On paper, justice has completed its task. But there are stories that don't end when a person stops breathing. 49 years is a long enough time for a child to grow up, mature, and grow old. Long enough for a generation to disappear. Long enough for the world to change completely. But for Richard Jordan, 49 years was just an endless wait. If he is guilty, then justice has come too late. If he is innocent, then it is a tragedy beyond redemption. Edwina Marta's family lost a mother, a loved one, in 1976. No sentence can bring her back. No sentence can erase the void that death leaves in the hearts of those left behind. Somewhere between those two tragedies lies the question that America continues to grapple with. Does the death penalty truly bring justice, or does it merely prolong punishment until no one is young enough to remember the original truth? Richard Jordan passed away quietly, but his story is not silent. It endures as a reminder that justice lies not only in the sentence, but also in time, certainty, and human compassion. And perhaps the most terrifying thing is not death itself, but the waiting for it, almost a lifetime.